All right. Good. I've got a Zoom meeting about it's okay. It's
All right. Good evening. It's great to see so many people here on Zoom. I am excited to hear tonight's talk about Mozart and everything involved with Mozart. And we have a special guest joining us tonight who is going to, I think, fill us in on some details about Mozart and his life and how he composes. And she has put together a very interesting slideshow to also share with us. But before we introduce Laura Prichard, I am going to introduce all of you to Paul Surapine, Claflin Hill's executive and artistic director, and also our founder and the principal clarinetist who will be performing Saturday night. So Paul.
Hi, it's nice to see so many people, and more people are joining as we speak. And thank you to Holly Krafka, the founder of the New World Chorale, who had suggested to us that we invite Laura Prichard to do a presentation on Mozart as a part of the festivities of this week's concert.
orchestra conductor.
So just to give you a short background, and by the way, Holly can't be with us tonight because she's teaching until 9 p.m. And that's something that's all of the Claflin Hill musicians and as many of the New World Chorale members that teach, when they're not playing and singing together, they're teaching. That's how we spend all our days, going from one performance or rehearsal, fitting our teaching in. That's the unique thing about building a culture of our own resident musicians at Claflin Hill and with the New World Chorale that, these are the people that live amongst us. They are the ones that are teaching our children. And, that's why it's so important as a community to support things like Claflin Hill and New World Chorale, because you can go into some other city and see something and that's nice and you paid a lot of money and you came home and they're not here, and we're in the schools teaching. We're the people you celebrate your life with, out in the park in the summer, 4th of July concerts, etc. So that's an important spiel now and then to reiterate. This concert is a reprise of the very first concert of the very first season of Claflin Hill Symphony. And that night was October 13th, 2000. That previous spring, we had put together a concert. I had put together a concert as part of a contract with New World, Worcester State College. We did Carmina Burana. Holly Krafka came to that concert that night at the town hall in Milford, walked up to me at the end, shook hands, said, congratulations on starting an orchestra. I just started a course. Call me. And that, that summer we put together this program where we do the Requiem of Mozart, and I would do the clarinet concerto as part of that. On that concert that night, we also did the Mozart Symphony Number 40. Coming out of the shutdown, which was even more difficult even for choruses as opposed to orchestras, because you're a chorus, you got 55 people that are singing their lungs out in a confined space. So it took quite a while for choruses to start making a comeback in the reopening. We talked over this past year, me and Holly, about doing something together, and that's how we came up with doing a reprise of that first night together. Over the years, New World Chorale has participated with us as a partner on some really major works. It's always been an important part of our mission to present chorus and orchestra music as part of our programming. Without people like us doing that together, it's a whole heritage and wealth of human artistic accomplishment that could fade from view. So in view of, you know, trying to be careful with budgets this year in the orchestra and our programming, the Mozart concert was great because it's a smaller classical orchestra. It's stuff that we all love and do. On that first concert many years ago, I did the clarinet concerto as conductor soloist. This night, I will perform it as a soloist with my orchestra, with my son Zachary taking the podium to lead our orchestra. He was a little kid in that room those 23 years ago when I first played it. Instead of doing a symphony, I thought we'd give another chance to the amazing musicians of Claflin Hill to be featured. So I decided on doing the Sinfonia Concertante for Winds, which features our principal oboist, Sashko Murata, our principal clarinetist, Terry Harrell, principal bassoonist, Tracy McGinnis, and principal horn, Neil Godwin. It's a quartet solo unit that plays from within the orchestra as the featured ensemble in this piece. For those of you that can date back to remembering Robert J. Lertzema, Morning Pro Musica, his sign-off music every day for decades at the top of the noontime hour was the final moments of the Sinfonia Concertante. And, you know, this also goes to the depth and also the mission of Claflin Hill as an orchestra for our musicians, that we feature all the soloists in our orchestra are always from within our orchestra. And we have that kind of depth of talent that live amongst us. You know, you don't have to pay $20,000 to get somebody off a airplane to come play the Mozart concerto. We can do it just as good. And this is our orchestra. So I'm really, you know, proud to be able to give those musicians a chance. We've, over the years, featured almost all the principal players of Claflin Hill Symphony in solo roles, and from inside the orchestra sections as well. So that is the wonder of this orchestra that we built. And I'd also like to thank the New World Chorale for being part of that all those years. Michael Prichard, who's singing this week with us in the Mozart, one of the most amazing moments in our partnership was doing the William Walton Belshazzar's Feast about a decade ago. And he did the solo oratorio part in that. And it was as if God was singing in the room, telling us the story of Babylon and the great king Belshazzar. So we're in for a real treat. The New World Chorale are helping us in this year of performing again together by helping to underwrite the cost of their participation in this concert. For that, we're all deeply grateful. And that's it. That's my spiel. I'm going to sit back and just listen to Laura, and if we'll have questions, and you know, you can point to me if you want me to say something. I'm done. Thanks. Great to see so many people.
This is Laura. Can I ask you, Paul, since you're playing the clarinet part on the Mozart, on the clarinet concerto, it's a really, really low clarinet part compared to sort of, you know, more modern clarinet concertos and things. And I wondered if you wanted to say anything about playing it. You know, it's one of the earliest ones. It's kind of an unusual piece to get to hear for a woodwind soloist.
Thank you. No, you know, you just got me thinking of it in a totally different way. Because as the clarinet has evolved, the clarinet that, and I think you were just talking about a clip you found of somebody talking about the Bassett clarinet. The original clarinet this was written for actually went much lower than present day clarinets do. And the clarinetist that Mozart wrote this for was, you know, to put it in the vernacular, one of his very best drinking buddies. And I heard a quote years ago on a broadcast when I first heard Harold Wright of the BSO do this live from Tanglewood on a radio. William Pierce, the voice of the BSO at the time, explained that Anton Stadler, though the greatest clarinetist of his time, was considered by Mozart's wife Costanza to be one of his secret bloodsuckers, and that on Mozart's passing, Anton suddenly was relieved of a whole debt load that he felt he no longer had to pay because he was a constant borrower of funds from his buddy. Um, the clarinet, this concerto actually goes almost 3 octaves in range from the very lowest note. We perform it today on the A clarinet, which is a little longer than the B flat clarinet that you see in band and most modern literature. It's got a darker, more mellow sound. It's a beautiful voice. The clarinet I'm playing on is a Selmer model of one of the original A clarinets that they made. It probably dates back to 1920. It's a little funky in its intonation in certain spots, but I love the sound of my clarinet. I'm comfortable with it. And just think of it as if I'm playing on Anton Statler's clarinet, because I mean, I can't imagine the intonation on those instruments was anything even approaching this. But it's it's a joyful piece of music that explores the entire, from the very lowest note on the horn to pretty much the highest note in several of the movements. And the slow movement is, I even had musicians coming up to me last night after we ran it for the first time saying, you know, that is one of Mozart's most beautiful and eloquent slow movements of all of his works. And I would argue the second one is a slow movement from his clarinet quintet that he wrote for the same rapscallion. Yeah, I mean, playing this piece, the moment I heard Harold Wright play it on the radio that night in July of 1974, I was getting ready to learn it as the All-State, Connecticut All-State audition piece the next year. I was going to be in 9th grade. And I played the first 8 bars of it when I first got my piece of music. I brought it to band. And it was like the most beautiful phrase of music I'd ever heard come out of my horn. And the moment I heard Harold Wright play it, I knew that I had to sound like that clarinet player. I had actually not really liked the sound of the clarinet up until that moment. It sounded crass, loud, squeaky. That's the way kids play it. And then I heard somebody play from the French school of clarinet playing, Harold Wright, who studied with the same teacher as my teacher of almost 2 whole decades, Calvin Opperman. They both studied with Ralph McLean, who was the greatest American clarinetist of the 20th century. And that sound that Harold Wright had was the only sound I chased all my career. So still chasing. Getting a little closer, but it's like a dog chasing a truck.
All right. Thank you, Paul, for sharing that background, and it gives us all something to look forward to on Saturday night. All right, Laura, take it away.
Okay, so hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to be talking about Mozart and how he developed into a very well-known respected writer of music for classical singers. And some of that had to do with his love of writing for woodwind instruments. So it's great to get to sing on a concert, the Requiem from 1791, right after we get to hear the clarinet concerto, also written in 1791. And a lot of the woodwind instruments we think about now as the old standard band instruments were really new at the time and were evolving, and they were really woodwinds, the flutes too, mostly, and they had very few keys. So I want to talk a little bit about Mozart and how he thinks about the voice, and then let you hear a little bit of a video from London of someone who's tried to have a copy made of Stadler's clarinet that we were just talking about. And then we'll hear a little bit of singing, and I wanted to focus on the bass voice, not just because of who I'm married to, but the sound, the way that Mozart writes for the bass voice is a lot like someone who is trying to mix in their mind the possible sounds of the voice and the possible sounds of these low ranges of woodwind instruments. So let me share my screen with you, and I'll be talking over some pictures. There's Little White Cat. If you can see Little White Cat, you are with us. First, let me show you some pictures of the people we've talked about so far. This is the only nice color painting we have of the clarinet player we've just been talking about, who came to Vienna around what ended up being the last years of Mozart's life. And there was a second Stadler who was also a clarinet player, his brother, and they had a woodwind quartet and a woodwind octet, and made good friends with Mozart and his brothers-in-law and local musicians, many of whom, you're right, did borrow things from Mozart and sometimes owe him money. And Mozart was considered very generous in that sense. Several people said in memory of him after he had passed away that he was one of the most generous people. He would give you the coat off of his back in a rainstorm. And certainly his wife and her sisters didn't appreciate that about all of his friends. So this is Stadler playing one of the smaller sizes of clarinets at the time. And then I wanted to show you pictures of two other instruments. This is the much bigger and curved bell with an extra little sound in reinforcing bell at the end, the basset clarinet that Stadler wrote for. And this is a reconstruction based on a drawing that we have. And the drawing comes from concert materials and a little bit of a program for a concert in Riga, Latvia. And that might sound really far away, but certainly music from the Austrian Empire was played in places like that. And so it was an attempt to draw the clarinet, the basset clarinet of the time, Stadler's clarinet. And so that's made it possible to reconstruct it. There's one other instrument. It's kind of interesting, musical walking stick, large recorders of various sizes, and Stadler composed for all of these things. Large recorders, you can see the huge long body of a wooden instrument just with 2 keys, or with 2 or 3 keys, and something that could be actually used as a walking stick in the street. And when you compare it to his clarinet over here, you can see 1 long key here, a second long key here. So 2 long keys for the left hand to extend the body of the instrument and allow him to play a note carved in a hole carved in the bell. And then a couple of keys on the lower body of the instrument and 1 up at the top. So 5 keys total on his clarinets. And then this basset clarinet has a few longer pieces. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. Let me put these pictures away and we can get them out if we want to in the future. So let me say just a few words about different things in Mozart's career. Let's play this as a slideshow and make it just a little bigger so people can see the pictures. So I put my name and my email there at the top. And if anyone wants to ask a question, they can write it in the chat, or you can unmute and interrupt me at any point. This is a painting that became very reprinted and popular. It's actually a British painting from the 1840s, 50 years after Mozart died. And it is a depiction of the scene of his deathbed. And so there are people present who we believe to be present, including his dark-haired wife, Constanza, and her sister, Joanna, who's the one that usually made comments about friends owing the money. And Franz Süssmayr is there taking some notes, and there are singer friends, including people who would be leading roles in Magic Flute right around that same time of life. Now, some people say Süssmayr, who's the main person that completed the Requiem we're singing this weekend, that Süssmayr was Mozart's student, but he was not much younger than him, and he was never his formal lessons paying type student. He certainly owned some of his music and hand copied a lot of it in an attempt to teach himself Mozart's style of composition, but he was already a working composer of church music at the time, and one of several people that Mozart's wife Constanze turned to help complete and to sell some of his manuscripts to make money for their family. She had at that point 2 sons. They had 2 surviving sons out of several children, 6 children total, that they had 4 of whom died in infancy. Basically, they had 1 child about every year and a half of their married life, and 2 sons survived. So she was looking for a way to support them and to make the most of her husband's legacy. And the people in the room here all helped to do that. So this is a painting set in 1791, but painted in 1846. So it's a little bit of a kind of an idyllic spectacle, but is the scene of his completion of the Requiem and singing through of parts of it. So how do we get from this, one person at a time, usually a tenor, singing alone on a stage, to this kind of modern conception with huge audience, being, rapt attention, not making noise, really focusing all their interest in a cult-like way on a stage, and the performer as a star. One of the ways we do that is to have singing evolve from a very small, intimate pastime to a public court activity. So I wanted to mention one particular person, a powerful woman who married into the French court. She was very active in the late Renaissance, 1500s, and she's the person that made most of Central Europe really interested in and start to financially support large-scale public performance. So there was a big sort of fully sung ballet opera type piece that was commissioned for her wedding. And then we have here a scene, one of the 5 nights of events for Catherine de Medici's wedding. And you can see there is not yet any kind of fixed seating for the audience. There is not an audience that's quietly placed right in front of a stage listening to what's going on, but rather balconies full of people moving around and talking. The room is, of course, lit all of the time. There's no darkening of lights or anything like that. And the players would actually move around in the space, and the singers could come right up to the most important people in the court and sing just a few feet from them. And the players and the singers might have their back a lot of the time to many of the audience members. So this would take about 200 years to evolve into our modern concert performance. But even in Mozart's time, it was rare for the audience to be quiet. So I let you see a little bit of the French court in the late 1500s, and I put on the side some of Catherine's innovations. She brought from Florence the idea of everyone wearing pantaloons or underwear. She brought ideas about pieces of garments that you would wear to keep your central shape held, intact and tight. And that certainly affected the loudness level of singers and the amount of deep breaths that woodwind players could, use to support. And so I just wanted to mention there's sort of a Renaissance way of being and singing and performing that starts in the late 1500s and survives almost until Mozart is born in 1750, with very little changes in overall costume, in overall performing style, and in overall aesthetics of what a concert could be. But during Mozart's lifetime, everything would change very quickly. Here's a typical room from 100 years later. This is the main room of the old Spanish consulate in Venice. And there's my mother, who's 5'2", waving in the back. It's now rentable as an Airbnb, and it's, you can tell, not a very big room. This is a typical performing space that the Spanish consulate would hold operas, concerts, and chamber music recitals in. If it were a staged performance, that little gold balcony that now has one bed up in it would be the balcony for the musicians. And the singer would enter where my mother is there and walk towards you. The table wouldn't be there, and you would be seated or standing roughly where those pink couches are. And that would be your performing space, a very intimate, small, resonant room. Baroque singing and Baroque wind playing, especially recorders, was in general quiet and intimate. From the 1600s, early 1700s, you basically have 2 kinds of singing in operas. You have speech-like singing called recitative, and songs, which would express one or maybe two emotions. And all different kinds of singers appeared in public singing these. Adult men, boys, adult women, married and unmarried, castrato singers. And they would usually be accompanied by a group of strings with different kinds of lutes. And you see here in the picture a harp. You see two long-necked lutes. They are both kind of like ancestors of the Renaissance lute and guitar. And a moderate-sized orchestra, sometimes with a little bit of brass, if you're going to have something martial or related to hunting. In this second bullet point here, I have arias, which all different kinds of singers could appear in public singing, versus choruses that still tended to be boys and men. Even after Mozart's death, even Beethoven's music, 30 years later in the 1820s, Beethoven only ever heard his choral music performed by choirs of boys and men. Typical thing to do if you want to present a concert, an oratorio, anything like that, was to write up the local cathedrals and hire several choirs of boys and men. Just before Mozart was born in the 1740s, Handel was an expert at this, and he would arrive in a new place, for example, Dublin. He would hire the best choirs he could get of boys and men. They would practice a few times and then put on a new work like his Messiah in 1741. And that was two downtown Dublin choirs, one from the Catholic Cathedral and one from the Anglican Cathedral, singing together with boys on soprano and smaller numbers of men, alto, tenor, bass. So our modern way of doing this, with more balanced numbers of women and men, and mostly women singing soprano and alto, really dates from the 1800s and the 1900s. Beethoven would have loved that, because we know that he heard that one of his pieces, the Missa Solemnis, was sung in St. Petersburg, Russia, with women singing soprano, and he wrote back in French, "That's a fantastic idea. We should totally have large groups of women replacing these irritating boys singing soprano. That's the future." And he even talked to the Viennese of his own time about trying to have that shift happen, but of course it didn't happen during his lifetime. So last bullet point here, the difference between concert music and church music is that we still have strings a lot of the time, but we replace the lutes and the harpsichord very often with church organs. And again, organs of this period are wooden whistles, and they are sometimes pipes having a reed in them, and they're very much like a collection of woodwind instruments and pipes blending with voices. Here's a still from the movie Amadeus, based on Peter Shaffer's play Amadeus, which is about 30% fact and about 60% imagined conversations filling in the gaps. And we know a lot, since even the 1990s, a lot more about Mozart's life and legal documents and personal letters and new manuscripts that have been rediscovered. So what would Mozart have seen and heard? He would have been, this is a pretty good shot in the movie, he would have been with his orchestra on the same level as the performers in front of a stage. And sometimes the stages wouldn't have been much higher than all those people sitting. The higher up the status of the performer, the more likely that you get to bring all your own furniture. And they would be listening to number one, recitative, to help tell the story. And Mozart would be seated at the harpsichord, often playing, rather than having his hands in the air conducting. Number two, he would be working with in advance and accompanying solo aria singers. Full orchestra would be playing, and he would just nod at them, and the first chair, first violin, would be in charge of keeping the orchestra together in a way almost more than he as the keyboard player was. He often sat this way and sometimes sideways. Sometimes with his back to the emperor, but usually sideways, so the emperor did not see his back directly. This would be a little shocking. And when he needed a full chorus for a concert situation, he would have only ever employed church choristers, choirs of boys and men. Until Richard Wagner in the late 1800s, there's no way to dim the lights in the hall particularly. They certainly didn't go around and put out candles and relight candles. So concert hall would have been just as bright as the stage area everywhere except the French court. In the French court in the Baroque, they really went in for strange stage effects. And so the audience might sit in the dark and have lights and explosions and trap doors in the floor. But in Mozart's Vienna, you're there to see not only the costumes on stage, but the costumes on everyone in the audience as well. Mozart's costumes in almost all of his operas still match the standard courtly dress and the heeled shoes for men of the day. Even if the opera is set in an exotic fairy tale location like Magic Flute would be, or if it's set in a Turkish harem, it's still going to be basically Viennese court dress with a little bit of Turkish harem decoration on the outside. Very few standing conductors in this period. More typical, the composer is present and they are playing along with the piece on a keyboard instrument, just like a modern jazz composer would be playing along on the piano throughout a jazz band presentation. Now, opera production evolved a lot. I won't read this whole slide to you, but here's an example of a recreated Baroque French opera. Excuse me. Yeah, a cough drop. This is a piece by Gluck, and Gluck had become well known as someone who wrote operas in Vienna and in Paris, and was a big champion of the future of modern opera in the middle 1700s. And his works were done with a lot of stage effects. There are a lot of scenes from the underworlds, gods and goddesses rising and being lowered through the stage. And this would influence Mozart a bit. Now, Gluck in music textbooks is talked about as a totally separate thing than Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, but their lives totally overlapped. Gluck died in 1787. Mozart would only live 4 years longer. Salieri led the music in memory of Gluck at the memorial service for him. It's one of the only times in Vienna that a requiem was actually performed for a musician while Mozart was there. So you can see all these different things that are happening in opera, and Mozart was interested in all that, but he wanted his music to be able to stand alone, and he did give concert performances of his operatic works. He also did travel a bit in order to lead some of his operas in other locations. Here's a typical Italian design, totally opposite, hardly a set at all. This is the opening scene for Marriage of Figaro as done by Boston Lyric Opera about 6 years ago. They really expected in Italian opera for the audience to suspend their disbelief, to have the music help them to imagine the whole thing. So it's much more like a concert presentation and oratorio, especially if the characters are dressed just like the audience running about. Well, Mozart was really influenced by the dress and the politics and the fashion and the literature of his time. He especially admired a French author and sometimes spy for the French government who went to England and spied for Louis XV, who went by the pen name Beaumarchais. Some people say that Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, which is one of the big pieces that he was completing after he had gotten married and before this final period of his life, when he writes the Clarinet Concerto and the Requiem. Some people say that the main character of Figaro is based on Mozart himself. And some people say that it is Beaumarchais basing the character on his own life himself. And certainly Mozart identified with Beaumarchais, someone who had to do a wide variety of things. In Mozart's mind, he was working in 3 totally different fields of music. Usually people would specialize. Mozart was an excellent church musician. He was an excellent concert performer, and also very interested in this world of Italian opera. And it was rare for people to do all those 3 things continuously throughout a program of, developing their ability to be a professional composer. Mozart would have written a lot more church music if he'd stayed in Salzburg, but he decided to leave and come to Vienna. He got to Vienna, and there were certainly lots of churches and cathedrals, but Maria Theresa had died in 1780, and Joseph II, who's featured as the emperor in the play and the film Amadeus, Joseph II, although he liked music and he employed, for example, a large group of woodwinds in his court orchestra, he really hated long services, especially long, cold Catholic services. And so he put out a series of edicts when he came to power in 1780, and this is right before Mozart moved to Vienna, saying in Vienna, and in general in the big places in the Austrian Empire, no more woodwind instruments in church. And there's a funny line like, clarinets are specifically banned, specifically proscribed from playing in church orchestras. And services need to be shorter and simpler, and we're not going to do the big giant orchestras. And it's implied, like the Salzburg Cathedral. Salzburg was its own separate little country at that point. So Mozart was going from somewhere that church music was supported better than anywhere in Christendom, more money and more players paid in Salzburg even than in Rome, in any one place, to Vienna, where he would have to shift his perspective. So once he moved to Vienna, he didn't write lots of masses and lots of church music, and really became more of a theater and chamber music composer. And so you have here on the right, Beaumarchais wearing the typical costume of the day. Mozart had a suit created to match Beaumarchais' outfit, and then the original Figaro was dressed just like both of them as well. So they're kind of seeing themselves as the great artists, the master of everything of their day. Some of Mozart's characters, especially the low basses, and especially the characters that sing with woodwind obbligato solos, are modeled on real people that he knew. Count Almaviva in Beaumarchais' Figaro plays is based on King Louis XV of France, who Beaumarchais had worked for as a spy, and who had hired Beaumarchais to be a music teacher to the princesses of France. And so it was delightful to get to make fun of the aristocracy in Vienna by saying they were making fun of the old King of France. Sort of get away with border crossing in that way. And so you see on the left the first costume of Count Almaviva from Marriage of Figaro, Mozart's setting of Beaumarchais' play, and then you see a contemporary painting of King Louis XV of France, and he is a baritone. And I wanted to let you hear a little bit of him, because this is sort of the voice of the employer as far as Mozart is concerned. And eventually, the voice of God, the voice of the person in charge in some of his classical pieces. So very briefly, in Marriage of Figaro, the Count's a mediocre man from a prestigious family, loosely modeled on the French king. He wants to be in charge, but he's losing control. So you'll hear the Italian sung on the left, and you'll see the English on the right. And we'll just hear a little bit of recitative and a little bit of the beginning of one of the Count's arias. And if it makes you think of the clarinet, that's good. Let's see if we can get it to work. Hang on just a second. Doesn't want to play, but we will make it. Okay.
Cosa sento? In qual laccio io crea?
I might need to turn it around that.
Perfidi! Io voglio di tal modo punire. A piacer mio la sentenza sarà. In qual maniera? E poi di Antonio, che ha un incognito Figaro ricusa d'Italia una nipote in matrimonio. Coltivando l'orgoglio di questo mentecatto, giavan raggiro il colpo è fatto
woodwinds come in. And he'll repeat that paragraph a couple more times and then go on and have a kind of a resolution to the dramatic action. And that's very common in Mozart. He takes the old Italian model of a recitative that kind of tells what's going on in the plot, and then creates a beautiful aria in one or two parts that basically asks one question or develops one emotion. And you'll hear this in his Requiem from 1791, the work he was working on when he died. And he kept taking breaks from it. It was assigned to him for commission. And he asked for a couple of extensions. And during the extensions, he wrote operas, he wrote chamber music, he wrote the clarinet concerto, he traveled a bit. And so he didn't quite finish it. So I wanted to mention a couple of characters related to the Requiem, since you'll be hearing that on the concert this weekend. It was commissioned by a young man named Franz von Walsegg. And Walsegg had lost his wife. He was only 28 years old. So this is an early engraving portrait of him. When Mozart passed away, in the middle of writing the work, Constanze turned to several of his colleagues, one being Antonio Salieri, who's kind of the villain of the Peter Schaeffer play Amadeus, but was a working musician, well-established, and a close colleague of Mozart in several different settings. He was certainly better known and better paid as an Italian opera composer than Mozart was when Mozart was in his mid-30s. He was only a little bit older than Mozart, and he was 40 when Mozart died. So he actually volunteered to give music lessons to Mozart's two surviving young sons and to help kind of guide their education a little bit. And he's one of about 8 male friends of Mozart who Constanze turned to help sort of preserve and benefit off of her husband's legacy. The main person that helped to complete the Requiem in the version that we are singing it is on the right here, Franz Süssmayr. And Franz or Frank was actually one of the most common names of the period. And X stands for Xavier or Xaver. And that's also one of the most common middle names. One of Mozart's children was even Franz Xaver Mozart. So these are kind of the men that help to get the Requiem created and help to make sure that it eventually gets completed. Salieri is one of the only working court musicians that had any experience conducting Requiems or who had ever edited other Requiems. So he was sort of an expert. And he was originally from Venice, where Requiems were more common in general for middle-level nobility. Now, certainly when Maria Theresa had died in 1780, there were tons of Requiems held in churches. And when Joseph II died in 1790, the year before Mozart died, there were Requiems written in his honor in Latin. And also there were some cantatas to German poems. For example, the young 19-year-old Beethoven even wrote a sort of a funeral cantata on the death of Joseph II, way far away from Vienna in faraway Bonn, which was connected to the Austrian Empire. So there was some tradition of it, but there were a lot of legends that Mozart was writing a requiem for himself and things like that. It was very, very rare for anyone of a musician's stature to have any music at all at their funeral. And then Salieri, as I mentioned, 1787, had put together a memorial service in honor of the arguably more famous composer, Gluck, opera composer, and conducted an Italian requiem at that memorial service. So it was sort of an interesting idea, but it was expensive and required very large forces to pull off. So you have the commissioner on the left, the sort of guiding figure, more established musician in the center, and the younger church musician and collaborator with Mozart, certainly someone who showed up and helped sing through music of his, who finished the work on the right. Who composed which parts of the Requiem? We're singing 1 through 7 on the left. Green is mostly Mozart, and Süssmayr orchestrated a little bit of that. So those first 2 movements you'll hear are pretty much all Mozart's. The next series of sections, Dies Irae, Tuba Mirum, Rex Tremendae, Recordare, Confutatis, and a little bit, just the first phrase of Lacrimosa, also was written out. The vocal parts were written out by Mozart, maybe made a couple of comments about a few important solo instruments, but in general, this is the big middle part of the Requiem, and it was completed by a variety of people, 4 different, slightly younger composers. Then the last third of the Requiem, in orange here, some vocal parts finished by Mozart, completed by Süssmayr, and then everything in red, Süssmayr said, I composed these, they are my work. And maybe he was following some directions by Mozart, but those don't survive. They were verbal directions at best. Now we know none of this music had been written by Mozart far in advance, because Mozart wasn't the kind of composer that made sketches years in advance and kept them around. If he wanted to write a piece of music, he wrote it. He wrote out the instrumentation, he finished it, and he kept it. And the paper that we find for all 7 of these movements is of 2 kinds, and we've studied it now, so we call it Tyson 62V paper, and it's very easy to see that that paper. He bought 25 pages of the same kind of paper in September 1791. It was called a choir, a group of 25 pages, and it has staves on it, musical staff on it, and someone has taken a ruler and drawn vertical lines and ruled the staff, drawn vertical bar lines that are very straight, very specific ink. So you can date all of that paper. That is the stuff with the stars. It's all written on those 25 pieces of paper bought at the same time in September. And then the things with the pluses, the very end of the Kyrie, end of the Recordare, the Confutatis, and that bit of the Lacrimosa that may be the last thing Mozart composed before he died. It's written on slightly different kind of paper. And he actually bought 2 whole choirs of this and a lot of his other late works, including the Clarinet Concerto and the Magic Flute is written on the Tyson 102 paper. So that doesn't tell us a lot. It just tells us he couldn't have been writing that music before September 1791. And then he only lives for about 3 months at that point. And so all this music is on the same kind of paper with roughly the same kinds of ink and from a concise period. This is a slide that I made that's a little messy, and then I had to zoom in. So just an example of one page of the Requiem. It's the end of the Kyrie eleison, which is the second movement of the Requiem. And it shows in Mozart's handwriting, the bottom part with fast notes and slow notes and cursive writing that says eleison, Kyrie eleison, and a nice whole note for everybody. A little bit of a fermata written over it. That's Mozart's handwriting down there in one kind of ink. Then in a different kind of a lighter ink, you have a little bit of Süssmayr, and Süssmayr is writing, I think that I think that's maybe brass in there, something simpler, and then a bunch of wind and string parts on the top in the hand of one of the other composers that helped out, Freistetler. And that gives you an idea of how messy this manuscript is. Usually you have just, Mozart writing, and you can see that he's drawn big long bar lines and slashes through the music, and it looks very different than some of the things written above it. Different handwritings, different inks, different style of writing. And then when they had to write out parts for things, it was very common for Constanza, Mozart's wife, to help make the parts. So there are actually a lot of performing parts from the late 1780s and early 1790s in her hand. She was a very well-trained musician, as were all the four sisters of the Weber family. And she helped out quite a bit, in spite of having 6 children, only 2 of whom survived, and running all the business related to his house. Here's an example of the handwriting of Franz Xaver Süssmayr. This is just a canon in 3 voices, gives you an idea of his written handwriting and his musical handwriting. So now there have been a lot of studies, so we can tell exactly which notes he contributed. What we don't know is if he contributed to the Requiem based on things Mozart said to him, or if a lot of it is his own musical inspiration at the end. So just a little bit of the clarinet of Mozart's time. This is a recreation made for the London soloist, clarinet and basset horn soloist for Music of the Enlightenment. And let's see if this is my second to last slide. So I won't play the whole video, but if you look up on YouTube, introducing Mozart's clarinet, you can hear him talk about how he got started playing the clarinet. And I just want you to hear 2 more examples of the sound of this instrument. You can see it only has 5 keys. Looks a little bit more like a recorder in that way. And it is a wood instrument. This is boxwood.
You can see that that shortens the tube. By the way, what we're doing when we're moving our fingers on and off the keys is just shortening the tube. When I've got lots of fingers down, it's a long tube, and as I take my fingers off, what happens is that the tube gets shorter. So effectively. So it's just a way of shortening the tube. So I shorten it again by opening another hole. And if I now put all my fingers down, I'm still missing a note. And you can hear that we need another note. So what they did was they put another key on that we do that. And what that does is it lengthens the tube slightly. So we get a lower note in between and because I've got a spare finger here. And so why we have keys on the clarinet is because we haven't really got enough fingers to do the job. That's why they put keys on it. Anyway, so this is the 5-key clarinet. And it was the staple instrument for quite some time. I've played later music on this. I played Beethoven's 9th Symphony on this. And Beethoven's 9th Symphony is quite a complicated sort of piece of music. So you can play more complicated music. But as time went on and the music got more complicated, it became much less possible to achieve the results that the composers were asking for.
So then he talks a little bit about the range of the Mozart Clarinet Concerto and the preference of the original player, excuse me, for the lower range, the Chalumeau range. I want you to just hear a little bit of the very end of it. Here's that picture again of Stadler's clarinet. And we'll hear just a little bit of the clarinet concerto again.
But you can't see them on the drawing. What you can see is the fact that it didn't go straight down, it turned round and had a bulbous bell. And so subsequently, everybody who's made a basset clarinet has put a bulbous bell on it. And I did, in fact, wonder whether or not to get a bulbous bell put on my clarinet, because we now know that Stadler had one. And I spoke to my friend Guy Cowley, who makes instruments, and he makes basset clarinets with this bulbous bell on it. And I said, do you think it would make much difference if could you put a bulbous bell on my basset clarinet so that it would be more à la mode? And so he said, well, I could, but actually the low notes on your instrument are quite resonant enough. As my children might have said earlier in their lives, they're well resonant. So the end of the concerto.
And I want to conclude with that idea of resonant notes, well resonant, the low instrument of an instrument, the low register of a woodwind instrument being particularly beautiful. And the way that Mozart was really opening up the writing for men's choral singers on lower parts, and also providing really new and unusually beautiful music for lower male solo voices. So I want to conclude with a solo from Magic Flute that Mozart took time out of writing the Requiem to write, in an unusual performance by the American concert singer Paul Robeson. And this actually takes a number for the priest Sarastro and has him sing it a whole step lower than it was printed. And we know that the person for whom it was written was one of those people at the bedside of Mozart, and was one of the people to sing through the completed parts of the Requiem around Mozart's bedside within a few days of his death. So this is Paul Robeson singing one of Sarastro's solos from Magic Flute, also from 1791, one of the last arias that Mozart completed while he was taking his third break from writing the Requiem. Let's see if it'll play. He's singing in English. This is E flat major instead of F.
This noble pair with wisdom's light, grant them your aid in their endeavor, lead them to find the path of right, lead them to find the path of right. Let them be strong against temptation, but if they fail in their probation, do not their virtue meed deny. Take them to your abode on high. Take them to your abode on high.
Okay, so that is all that I had, basically. So I'm curious if people have questions. You can certainly, write us emails and we can answer in fuller length as well. Let me put Stadler's clarinet back up there again. for those that are interested.
If anyone
right,
has
let's-
any questions, you could either put it into the chat or unmute yourself and ask them while Laura's here. This has been delightful, Laura. So informative and yet easy to understand. So appreciate everything that you put into this. Thank you.
Thank you,
Paul,
Laura.
yeah.
You know, you
Well,
couldn't have invented it any better, by the way. I mean,
Well, we're
it's
looking forward to the clarinet music. It's the perfect thing for us to get to hear, great breathing and support and woodwind playing right before we have to channel great breathing and support in a choral setting. So,
well, but yeah, I'll say this to the chorus. I was going to say, if any of the chorus members don't have tickets, because I mean, they're singing in the concert. I know we did a special offer for them to get tickets for family and so on. Any empty seats, they want to come out and see the first half, just find a seat and sit there. It'll be an honor to play for you. I mean, but what I wanted to say, ending it with Paul Robeson, it's really kind of weird because he lived in my hometown
Really?
of Enfield, Connecticut. This huge mansion was built on Enfield Street, pretty much across from where the present day Enfield High School is, set back from the road. He came there, he had actually gone to Russia to live for a while back in like the early part of the, I don't know, 1920s, 30s, thinking that the Soviet society would be more receptive to African Americans or African people, and found that it was even worse there. He had been enticed over as a sort of icon of, champion of all people and that sort of thing. But when he got there, he realized it was even worse. And he came home to America and built a home in Enfield, Connecticut, which is still there to this day. And he had one of the greatest voices. I mean, but if I closed my eyes, I could almost have thought I was listening to Michael just now too. So, yeah.
as you said, it's crucial to hear someone that has wonderful tone and then strive for years and decades and maybe a whole life to achieve, that tone and to have an ideal of the sound of an instrument. Because as singers, we're just limited to our instrument in our throat. We can develop better diction and we can work on our breathing and our breath support, but at a certain level, genetics gives us a certain instrument in our throat. It's like you buy the clarinet, that's the clarinet you have. And so we struggle against that and we push our boundaries. And then especially with choral singing, you're trying to blend with people from all over the world. And it's great to have, the experience to get to hear the resonance of his voice and what he could really do with that instrument. Really an incredible voice.
Funny thing, you may know, I have a brother, Matthew, who is a singer also, and is actually coming to sing with us in April. He sung with the symphony. He was a clarinet player and a clarinet student of my teacher in high school, and suddenly gave it up because he wanted to go into business and be a millionaire, and that didn't work out. He came back to music through his voice because he'd always had a great voice, and he started studying seriously and with a vocal teacher in New York who said to him, "Wow, you sing like a musician." And he said, "Well, I was taught to play clarinet like a singer." That we listen to how singers sing. I mean, that's the most perfect instrument of all, the voice. And that's the rest of us are trying to imitate the human voice mechanically.
Let me share my screen again. I'll show the house that you're talking about. This is his house.
Yes, there it is.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think my
1221
dentist
Enfield
lives there
Street.
now.
Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
actually, my boyhood dentist built his own house right next to that, but that's the Robeson Mansion, which now, as a matter of fact, It's owned by the Troiano family in Enfield. Italian immigrants came to America, became successful, and had a huge kind of oil company. I guess you could say they were the Jeffrey Mushnick Medway Oil and Propane of Enfield, Connecticut. But it's a beautiful house.
Yeah.
Almost looks like something out of Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Great.
Very cool. All right. Any
Well, thanks very much.
questions from anyone?
Hi, John.
John.
Yes, John.
Yeah, Laura, this is wonderful. I'm curious about the Stadler clarinet with that bulb at the end, and the way that it seemed to be set up. It was like the performer would have to hold it, what, like a tenor sax or something, I guess. Just looking at the way it is, otherwise the bottom would point back between the person's legs, wouldn't it?
It seems, yeah.
Yeah, let me
Very
put in the
cool.
chat. There's several articles on it online, but there's a person that makes clarinets and restores clarinets named Stephen Fox. He does reproductions of historical woodwinds, and that's his page that talks about, if you'd like to order a Stadler style bassett clarinet, his description of sort of what it is. And he says, there's no exact original examples of this, even though there are places like in Nuremberg and the German National Museum, there were literally multiple cases of like hundreds of thousands of dollars of ancient clarinets that are cracked now and can't be played, the original ones, but there's no existing copy of this. So I put in the chat his page where he talks about there are ways to try to reconstruct it from that Riga concert program from 1794 where he played. And then there's a 5-key clarinet in Vienna that exists, and there are a couple of bassett horns in the Mannheim Music Instrument Museum. But his little webpage there has a nice description of it. And most people say you take that bulb and you put it backwards between your legs, and there's even a little hole on the bell elbow joint, and you could press it against your leg and your leg could close that hole. So, you can play with your fingers, and then I guess your leg, you're like, this is the bell, your leg could go do, 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 and you can even get a further low note out of it. Super fun.
You have to have good rhythm in your leg, though.
Yeah. And the video that I showed, let me just find it. The video that I showed, I should put that in the chat as well, because he does talk about how in order to add longer keys to the clarinet, you would have to play a lot of those keys with your thumbs, and it would, on the back of, a lot of these things, it starts to look like almost the back of a bassoon a little bit. Well, let's see. Let me just look it up. I think it's just called Introducing Mozart's Clarinet. If I do this right, I can find it quickly. Dun, dun. Yes.
As I'm in the midst of applying.
It's this series of videos that were made by an orchestra called the Orchestra of the Age of the Enlightenment. And let me put that second YouTube link. They have maybe 20 videos about their different instruments, that all the woodwinds are reconstructions. Nobody plays a real 200-year-old woodwind, but you can get a reconstruction made of a 200-year-old woodwind. And yeah, so.
Now we know what to get Paul for his birthday this year.
I know. Well, sometimes you buy a conductor a beautiful musical stand, like someone will create a music stand and carve it, and it's like, you want to impress me? You want to impress me and carve a clarinet for me?
There you go.
Yeah, well, I like having all the extra keys.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can always not use them.
Yeah, no, I need all the help I can get.
Right. But I mean, if you don't press the keys down at the clarinet, as far as the clarinet's concerned, the keys aren't there.
Yeah,
but
that's
we
true.
didn't even get into, you know, the whole inside the clarinet. They're all different shapes.
Right.
There's conical
the clarinet,
bores and regular bores, and
right.
yeah,
I mean,
all that really changed a lot right around 1900. The early jazz clarinet players play all different kinds of crazy instruments, so it's very
I
fun.
actually have a clarinet that dates back to about 1900. It was what we called the Albert system or
Yep.
simple system, and it's very similar. It had a few more keys than that Mozart clarinet we were looking at, but still half the amount of keys we now have. Funny thing, just before the pandemic, I was teaching at Rhode Island Philharmonic School of Music. I'd been there for a while, and I had a new student came in, um, and come to find out, this nice little boy comes in with one day, first lesson. I go to say hello to him, introduce myself. He kind of looks at me, and his mother says to me, he doesn't speak English. I said, oh, okay. They're French. They're over here. If father was working on building a yacht in Newport or something. Um, and she said, well, I'll listen to you and translate. And I'm trying to use as many words from my junior high school French as I can remember. And then he takes out the clarinet, and it's like something they got in Germany, and it's an Albert system. And I don't even know how to play this key system, really. So it was, but we had a good time for a couple months until they went on to their next, I don't know, travels. They were going somewhere else after December, and then came the shutdown. So, but it was kind of, not only did he have a totally different clarinet from a different time, but we didn't speak the same language either. And yeah, somehow played clarinet notes though together.
You mentioned that you're playing a Selmer, so I put the link from Selmer's site. Selmer's a French maker. They have a really nice short article online with a lot of pictures of early instruments. That's a history of the clarinet. And they're mainly concentrating on the kind you're playing, not all the different weird larger sizes.
I mean, I don't think there's any clarinet geeks. Well, I know the Hoppies are very fond of clarinet, but where Selmer was like one of the great clarinet manufacturers, though we were always brought up on good French buffet clarinets. So Selmers were kind of like, hey, no, I don't want the Selmer, except this one was given to me by somebody. And when I showed it to my teacher, who used to rebuild clarinets, all my horns were clarinets that he redid everything to, re-drilled, redid all the key work, made barrels and mouthpieces for them. So they're all unique horns. And when I showed him this clarinet, I said, yeah, but it's a Selmer. He said, this is the model Selmer that Buffet copied when they started turning out a clarinet. So it goes back to that. And, I guess, you don't need to be a snob when it comes to beautiful instruments.
No, I mean, it's a local history too. I mean, it originally, it's Alexander Selmer, it's Selmer, the French name, and they came to this country because Alexander Selmer moved from the Conservatory of Paris to become the principal clarinetist for the BSO. So a lot of the history of what you're talking about is local history specific to our area. So before it was ever New York or any of that.
To expound on that, after Selmer, in the 1930s, the principal clarinetist of the Boston Symphony was the greatest French clarinetist of all time, named Louis Cahusac. His student was Ralph McLean, who studied with him during Cahusac's brief time in Boston. Cahusac went back to Paris. McLean went there, then came back to New York, taught my teacher, and became the principal clarinet of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and was actually the man who premiered the Copland Clarinet Concerto, which was commissioned by Benny Goodman, but premiered by Ralph McLean. So, when I share this with my students and ones that graduate, get a picture what do you call it, montage of, you know, their genealogy. My teacher, his teacher, Louis Cahuzac. Not too many people can trace their lineage in 3 hops back to the greatest thing that ever was in that discipline. You know, so it's like studying law with John Marshall, maybe.
Awesome. Well,
Thank
we're looking forward.
you. Yes,
Great.
so
Well, thanks, Bernadette, for coordinating this.
absolutely. It was
This,
such a
been,
pleasure.
this was really great, Laura. I mean,
Yeah.
I enjoyed it immensely. I was the sort of kid in college that skipped most of my required classes like theory and music history. I just wanted to practice, but this is the sort of music history class I always liked. You know, it's about the humanness of what we do, not about the structure and the chord changes or something. It's about, you know, those composers, those musicians were just like us today. They had the same kind of lives and struggles. And, you know, you look back on it and you just, there's so much going on out there that can put you in a bad mood every day. And I'm, you know, I'm like the poster child for that, trying to keep our little piece of it alive right now. But, you know, you I was sitting there listening to the soloists go through their aria parts of the Requiem last night. And, you know, that joy of hearing that piece come to life again, and just in the skeletal parts, because Holly was just taking this and that, because that's how we do these things. You know, putting in there together the jetliner right there on the runway just a couple hours before takeoff. And you think, what a privilege it is for us to endeavor to do this with great people and for great people that come to be part of it. You know, I mean, it's like the whole thing is about um, being witnesses. That's, you know, the highest thing you can do in life is to witness all around you and to be a part of it instead of a passive spectator.
So come Saturday night and witness this concert live. The Claflin Hill Symphony Orchestra, Milford Town Hall, 52 Main Street, Milford, Mass. Tickets online, claflinhill.org. We'll be featuring New World Chorale. It's going to be amazing. Tickets are available. And if anyone has any questions, you can contact me, B. Stockwell, at claflinhill.org, and go on Facebook, send a message. Thank you so much. I'll be posting this recording and I'll be sharing a link so that if you have friends that weren't able to join tonight, they'll be able to take a look at it on YouTube, hopefully by tomorrow. All righty. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you
Saturday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.